Welcome to Ask Historians Aloud. Welcome to Ask Historians Aloud. I'm Mark Evans, and I'll be your host today. Today we continue this series, which features questions and answers from our subreddit, provided by our amazing Flare panel. This is a way of casting light on the great questions and answers that are happening every day at Ask Historians. To learn more, or for even more content, check out our fantastic pieces on Facebook and Twitter. Please also check out the Patreon, which goes towards supporting the work that we do here. Today's episode will answer the question asked by JJVMT and answered by sunagainstgold. Today's answer was provided by Ask Historians flared user and moderator sunagainstgold in response to the question, were women voters subject to vote suppression campaigns in the 1920s like those forced on African Americans after the Reconstruction? Links to the thread can be found in the podcast description. The following transcript has been lightly edited. The newspaper clippings and broadside ads from the 1920s were unequivocal. Male politicians needed women voters. One woman voter in Virginia commented, "We are the most popular people ever. The candidates all think that they have wanted the women to have the vote and have always worked hard to attain this end." Male politicians from Alabama to Massachusetts assured women that although they had once opposed women's suffrage, recent events had caused them to reconsider somewhat their former position. After Arizona's women achieved suffrage slightly ahead of the national benchmark, male politicians campaigned by endorsing themselves with "My mother believed in suffrage, my grandmother believed in suffrage." A survey of 1,000 black women voters in the South found that none of them faced any discouragement from their husbands or fathers in voting. Even the Kinder, Küche, Kirche sexism of, yes, the KKK, allowed their Atlanta newspaper to print an appeal to Protestant women to register and vote. Your ballots are your bullets. And yet, women's voter turnout throughout the 1920s dragged perilously behind men's. Half the electorate, women constituted around 1/3 of the votes. The curious thing is, scholars have demonstrated that the imbalance at the polls did not actually reflect women's lower participation in social and political activism. Women's clubs and women's participation in co-ed organizations through the interwar period increased even above the heady suffragist days of the 1900s and 1910s, and even as further women's causes, like an equal rights amendment, failed at the polls. As you can probably imagine, the reasons are complicated and inextricable from the nativism, xenophobia, and brutal racism of the 1920s. Women's voting and political activism in the US is usually cast through a white-black dichotomy, so let me start with a broader picture. The US government had granted citizenship to Native Americans who gave up their tribal affiliation in the late 19th century. The 1924 Indian Citizenship Act extended that as a blanket provision to all, men and women. However, individual states and localities often acted to deprive native citizens of their voting rights. Colorado declared that they were not state citizens, so could not vote there. English literacy requirements were another major stumbling block. So native women watched their chance to vote be suppressed. The 1920s also deprived Japanese immigrants of the choice to naturalize as citizens. And it wasn't until 1930 that feminists succeeded with the Cable Act, detaching women's citizenship status from their husbands. That is, prior to 1930, even a woman born in the United States would lose her citizenship, thus her right to vote, if she married an immigrant who had not naturalized, or not yet. Because it was such a priority of women activists to repeal this law, we can posit it affected more American-born women negatively than foreign-born women positively. Well, I hope, and the rest of this might suggest my optimism is misplaced. But the voter registration, which we have data for, and turnout numbers calculated by Kevin Corder and Christina Volbrecht, do also show much lower engagement for black women and white women, despite all those platitudes listed above. I'm going to argue that the underlying reason for patterns of women's participation was the result of a dichotomy between how women voters saw themselves and how men in positions of authority, from husbands to governors, perceived women as newly empowered political actors. Women wanted to act. Men believed that women should help men act. Contemporary accounts, taking note of the gender disparity in voting, were clear about one thing. There was no biological, innate reason women couldn't vote. Margaret Wells, in 1929, stressed that women's participation would increase gradually as New Age cohorts were socialized to believe in themselves as citizens. Indeed, the percentage of younger women voting steadily outpaced older women who had grown up under different ideals of gender and citizenship. There was also a lot of socialization to overcome. 9% of white women in one Midwest survey said they didn't feel comfortable voting personally, whatever their thoughts about suffrage in general. In the South, gender roles of women as men's helpmeet were particularly entrenched in white culture, among women as well as men. For all their apparent courting of women as voters, white male politicians were largely unwilling to cede actual power in governance to women. With women and women's organizations demanding equal seating at political party meetings and as candidates for office, men found ways to sideline this drive. The token female high in the political party was a popular strategy. First, it isolated her from potential women allies against forming a women's bloc of political interests or choosing candidates. Second, it meant women's chances in politics were heavily linked to their support of local party line policies. Other tactics were choosing women for races the party was certain to lose, appointing widows to finish the last months, days, or hours of their dead husband's term in office, and running women candidates for education superintendent and other positions with the dignity of office without the power or money. Contemporaries argued this impeded women's desire to vote. A woman candidate can bring out more women's votes than anything else, observed a party strategist in the 1920s. A lot of these sources are from newspaper clippings gathered into scrapbooks, hence the lack of specificity. The New Orleans League of Women Voters passed this resolution. Whereas the evident reluctance of men politicians to receive the newly enfranchised women voters into their innermost councils has resulted in depriving both parties of the judgment and counsel of women, and whereas few women have as yet ventured into the political arena and aspired to public office, be it resolved that the League of Women Voters urges women to fit themselves for office, to register and pay their poll taxes, and also demands that the men at the head of party organizations allow their women to have a voice in choosing candidates and in formulating principles of action. Despite the furious activism of white and black women's clubs, no women served in the Louisiana state legislature in the 1920s. No women held positions of power in the reigning Democratic Party. No women won seats in civic government in New Orleans. And women's voter registration here lagged further behind the rest of the state, and further behind the rest of the nation. Male politicians explicitly believed that women should help men. A male candidate from South Carolina confessed he was planning to ride in on the women's vote. Another, in Virginia, urged women voters to stand back of me in this fight of my life. Black men's organizations called upon black women to register, especially in the South. The poll tax required in most places to vote was cumulative. Women had no back debt to make up. And South Carolina had exempted all women from its poll tax anyway. They wanted women to make up for their inability to vote. The opportunity to aid the men, one man called it. The presumption absolutely was that black women would vote as black men did. It was one of white politicians' greatest fears, in fact. White men did not share this view of white women's potential votes. In the famous 1923 Non-Voters Survey by Charles Merriam and Harold Gosnell, 1% of women admitted they didn't vote because their husbands wouldn't let them. In the South, where Republicans actually stood a chance of gaining ground from white women, one identified problem was white, ergo Democratic, men refusing to pay or give money to pay the poll tax for their wives. And unfortunately, and of course, one of the biggest reasons white men supported white women voters was to eliminate black women's and men's votes. And white women were all too often happy to oblige. One avenue of appeal urged white Democratic women to cast their ballots to cancel out black women. A male-authored article from Texas pleaded, "Quite a number of Negro women have been paying their poll tax at Fort Worth. Will white women please take notice?" The Georgia United Daughters of the Confederacy showed white women would stand with white men against their supposed sisters in arms. Citing the terrifying stacks of registration papers registered by Negro women, the UDC resolved, "For every evil vote there must be one on the other side. the side of truth and honesty to counteract the evil. Black women met with fierce resistance at registration, while voting, and even just existing as registered voters. That same Fort Worth paper got a hold of the voter registration list, organised by name, gender, race, and ward of voting, standard practice, and targeted one black woman as an example. They printed Mattie Henry's name and full home address, with the ominous implication that she and other black women should not have crossed some line. In Mississippi, black women teachers were threatened with losing their jobs if they voted. In North Carolina, with lynching. The general provisions levied to restrict voting to rich and propertied white men, poll tax, literacy requirements, residence rules, and so forth, even before women's suffrage fell more heavily on even white women than white men, as you can see glimpses of the above. The general provisions levied to restrict voting to rich propertied white men, poll tax, literacy requirements, residence rules, and so forth, even before women's suffrage, fell more heavily on even white women than white men, as you can see glimpses of above. The literacy test was especially odious, since its administration was entirely contingent on the election registrar. He could choose whether to have a person fill out an existing form, or play impossible constitutional law jeopardy in order to pass. I'm sure you're sad and unsurprised to hear this suppressed black women's voting far more than white women's. Richland County, South Carolina, Columbia and environs is instructive. The first day women could register, the officials were apparently overwhelmed and flummoxed, issuing registrations right and left, white and black, forgetting about the literacy test altogether. But overnight they held a war council. No, really, that's what the newspaper clipping says. The next day, black women were forced to wait in line until all white people had registered. They were subject to literacy tests with ridiculous questions. How much does the Baptist Church pay the state? Or, how many drops of water is there in Mississippi? White women organised mobile voter registration drives to evade misogynist officials. How simple it was to omit black neighbourhoods from their routes. The White League of Women Voters explicitly refused to support black women's struggles for suffrage, on the ground and in the courts. Famous suffragist Alice Paul said it wasn't a purely feminist issue. Black women were by no means passive victims. They challenged for their rights in court. They stood in lines, and they organised. The Savannah Negro Women's Club was so successful in their own voter registration drive that the number of black women registered to vote equalled the number of white women. After the 19th Amendment passed, Georgia refused to open up extra registration windows for women to get in on the 1920 presidential election. On election day, black women showed up anyway. In the years after the 19th Amendment, women's registration to vote and actual voting lagged behind men's. It's a complicated story to tell, because deep structural factors of sexism and racism motivated both men's resistance to and support for women voters. Women of all races faced practical and emotional barriers to voting. The traditional belief that women should be behind men and within the household, patriarchal family, or supporting and helping men, persisted even as women asserted their voices in the public sphere. Many of the restrictions even white women were subject to had been implemented to eliminate black men voters. Nevertheless, white women collaborated with white men to deprive women of colour, native and non-European immigrants, as well as African American, of their voting rights even more firmly. Still, we can't forget that 1/3 of women did vote, and those numbers increased. And while men supported women, it was largely the tireless effort of white and black women on behalf of their own communities that got out women's voters. Though, after suffrage, never again a unified woman's vote. You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.